With a trembling signature on inheritance papers and a desperate hope for financial relief, single mother Sarah Martinez unknowingly stepped into a military conspiracy that had been buried for 70 years, one that would challenge everything historians believed about America's most celebrated war heroes. For hidden within her great-aunt's dusty farmhouse attic lay a diary containing evidence that certain high-ranking military officials had gone to deadly lengths to rewrite history and protect reputations built on lies and betrayal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain hammered against Sarah Martinez's windshield. As she navigated the winding country road toward Millbrook Valley, her 8-year-old daughter Emma fidgeting in the back seat with a tablet that had seen better days. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as she thought about the mounting bills in her purse, the eviction notice that had arrived 3 days ago, and the desperate phone call to her boss begging for an advance on her salary from the diner where she worked double shifts just to keep their heads above water. The call from the attorney had come at the worst possible time, though Sarah couldn't imagine when would have been a good time for news about inheriting property from a great-aunt she barely remembered meeting. Aunt Evelyn Cartwright had been the family eccentric, the one who never married, never had children, and lived alone on a farm that seemed frozen in time from the 1940s. Sarah's mother had mentioned her occasionally, usually with a shake of the head, and comments about how Evelyn had never gotten over losing her fiancé in World War II. Now, at 29, Sarah found herself the unlikely inheritor of a property she'd never seen, in a town she'd never visited, dealing with an estate she couldn't afford to maintain. The attorney had been blunt about the situation. The farmhouse needed extensive repairs, the land was barely valuable enough to cover the property taxes, and the whole place would need to be cleared out before any potential sale. A weekend job that would hopefully provide enough equity to solve her immediate financial crisis. Emma pressed her face against the rain-streaked window as they approached the farmhouse. "Mommy, it looks like a haunted house from my storybooks," she said with the kind of excitement only an 8-year-old could muster for something genuinely creepy. Sarah had to admit her daughter wasn't wrong. The 2-story farmhouse stood like a monument to neglect, its white paint peeling in long strips, the wraparound porch sagging under the weight of decades and weather. Tall grass and weeds had reclaimed what had once been a well-maintained yard, and several shutters hung at odd angles like broken wings. The whole property had an air of abandonment that went beyond simple disuse, as if time itself had forgotten this place existed. They parked near the front porch, and Sarah helped Emma out of their aging Honda Civic, both of them making a dash through the downpour to the shelter of the covered entrance. Sarah fumbled with the brass key the attorney had given her, surprised, when it turned smoothly in the lock, despite the obvious age of the mechanism. The door swung open with a prolonged creak that made Emma giggle nervously. The interior hit them with a wave of musty air, the scent of old paper, lavender sachets, and something indefinably nostalgic that reminded Sarah of her grandmother's house. Surprisingly, the electricity was still connected, and when Sarah flipped the switch near the door, warm light filled the front hallway, revealing a home that seemed to exist in a time capsule from the mid-20th century. The living room was furnished with heavy wooden pieces upholstered in faded florals, doilies covering every surface, and photographs in ornate frames arranged on the mantelpiece above a stone fireplace. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, but otherwise appeared untouched, as if Aunt Evelyn had simply stepped out for an errand rather than passed away in a nursing home after 3 years of declining health. Emma immediately gravitated toward a bookshelf filled with old volumes, while Sarah tried to process the enormity of the task ahead of them. Every surface held some collection of items: china figurines, antique books, letters tied with ribbons, and photographs dating back to what appeared to be the early 1900s. This wasn't going to be a weekend job. This was going to require weeks of careful sorting and packing. As they explored the main floor, Sarah found herself drawn to the photographs scattered throughout the house. Many featured a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Sarah herself, with dark hair and determined eyes, often pictured with a handsome man in a military uniform. These had to be photos of Aunt Evelyn and her fiancé, the one who had died in the war and left her heartbroken for life. The kitchen was a marvel of 1940s efficiency, with a vintage stove, an icebox that had been converted to electric refrigeration, and cabinets filled with dishes and glassware that hadn't been manufactured in decades. Sarah made a mental note that some of these antiques might actually have value with collectors, possibly enough to make this inheritance worthwhile after all. Upstairs, they discovered 3 bedrooms, each decorated in a different era's style, but all maintaining that same sense of preserved time. The master bedroom contained Aunt Evelyn's personal effects: a vanity table with silver brushes and mirrors, a wardrobe filled with clothing that spanned decades, and a bedside table with reading glasses resting on an open book, as if she'd just set it down. But it was the narrow staircase at the end of the hallway that captured Sarah's attention. A small door marked what appeared to be access to the attic, something the attorney hadn't mentioned during their brief phone conversation. Emma tugged on her mother's shirt, pointing up the stairs with curiosity. "Can we see what's up there, Mommy? Maybe there's treasure like in the pirate movies?" Sarah hesitated, glancing at her watch. They'd planned to spend just a few hours getting a sense of the property before driving back to their apartment in the city, but Emma's enthusiasm was infectious. And honestly, Sarah was curious too. What did someone keep in an attic for 70 years? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The attic door opened easily, revealing a steep set of wooden stairs that disappeared into darkness above. Sarah found a light switch at the bottom of the stairs, and a bare bulb illuminated what turned out to be a surprisingly spacious attic area with slanted ceilings and multiple dormer windows that would have provided natural light during the day. The space was organized with the same meticulous care evident throughout the rest of the house. Wooden trunks lined one wall, their brass fittings tarnished but intact. Garment bags hung from rafters, protecting what appeared to be vintage clothing. Boxes labeled in careful handwriting indicated contents like Christmas decorations, school papers, and mother's china. But it was a small wooden desk positioned beneath one of the dormer windows that drew Sarah's attention. Unlike everything else in the attic, this area appeared to have been used regularly. The desk surface was clear, except for a leather-bound book, an antique fountain pen, and a small framed photograph of the same military man from the pictures downstairs. Emma had discovered a trunk filled with what appeared to be vintage toys, and was exclaiming over a porcelain doll with real hair and a wardrobe of tiny dresses. Sarah approached the desk slowly, something about its deliberate arrangement suggesting importance beyond mere storage. The leather-bound book proved to be a diary, its pages yellowed, but the ink still clearly legible. The first entry was dated September 15th, 1943, written in the same careful handwriting that had labeled the storage boxes throughout the attic. Sarah opened to a random page and began reading what appeared to be a love letter never sent, written to someone named Lieutenant James Morrison. "My dearest James, another day passes without word from you, and I find myself wondering if the stories we've been told about your heroic sacrifice are the whole truth. The man who came to tell me of your death couldn't meet my eyes when he spoke of how you died. Something in his manner suggested there was more to tell, something he wasn't authorized to share. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. She flipped to another entry, this one dated several months later. I've been asking questions about the 82nd Battalion's final mission, the one where James supposedly died saving his fellow soldiers from an enemy ambush. But I've spoken to 3 different families who lost sons in that same unit, and their stories don't match what we were told. Mrs. Henderson says her boy wrote to her just days before he died, claiming there was something wrong with their commanding officers, that orders were being given that put American soldiers in unnecessary danger. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she turned more pages, finding entries that grew increasingly detailed and disturbing. Aunt Evelyn hadn't just been a heartbroken fiancée grieving her lost love. She had been conducting what appeared to be a systematic investigation into military misconduct during World War II. Entry after entry detailed conversations with other military families, inconsistencies in official reports, and questions about decorations and commendations that seemed to have been awarded to officers who had actually been responsible for unnecessary casualties. Sarah found herself absorbed in what read like a detective story, except this was real, and the implications were staggering. October 1944. Spoke with Colonel Patterson's widow today. She showed me letters her husband had written expressing concerns about General Morrison, yes, James's own father, making tactical decisions that appeared designed to eliminate certain officers and enlisted men who had been asking uncomfortable questions about supply line irregularities. Could it be that James discovered his own father was involved in something criminal? Sarah sat back in the small desk chair, her mind reeling. General Morrison. She'd heard that name before, during high school history classes. He'd been one of the celebrated heroes of the European theatre, credited with several major victories and awarded numerous commendations for his leadership and bravery. If this diary was accurate, it suggested that his reputation had been built on covering up his own crimes. Emma's voice drifted up from where she was playing with the vintage toys. "Mommy, why are there so many pictures of soldiers in all these boxes?" Sarah looked around the attic with new eyes, realizing that what she'd initially taken for random storage was actually an organized archive. Those carefully labeled boxes might contain more than just personal memorabilia. They might contain evidence of whatever Aunt Evelyn had been investigating for decades. She opened the nearest box, labeled Correspondence 1943-1947, and found hundreds of letters, both handwritten and typed, many bearing official military letterheads. Some were addressed to Evelyn Cartwright, others appeared to be copies of letters sent to government officials, military investigators, and newspaper editors. A letter dated December 1945 caught her attention, written on War Department letterhead, and signed by someone with an illegible signature but clear title, Assistant to the Secretary of War. The letter was brief and coldly formal. Miss Cartwright, your continued inquiries regarding the circumstances of Lieutenant Morrison's death and the actions of the 82nd Battalion have been noted by this office. You are advised that these matters have been thoroughly investigated by appropriate military authorities and found to be without merit. Further correspondence on this subject will be considered harassment of military personnel and may result in legal action. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. This wasn't just the ramblings of a grief-stricken woman. This was evidence of an active cover-up. Someone with real authority had been threatened enough by Aunt Evelyn's questions to send official warnings. She opened another box and found newspaper clippings, dozens of them, all related to military awards ceremonies, promotion announcements, and obituaries of war veterans. Many were annotated in Evelyn's handwriting, with notes like, "Promoted immediately. After James's death, citation doesn't match reported battle location, and family says he died questioning orders." In a larger box labeled Photographs and Documents, Sarah discovered what appeared to be official military records, though how Aunt Evelyn had obtained them was unclear. Personnel files, battle reports, casualty lists, and communication logs that painted a very different picture of certain military operations than what had been reported to the public. One document made Sarah's blood run cold. It was a communication log from the 82nd Battalion, dated just 3 days before Lieutenant James Morrison's reported death. The entries showed a series of coded messages between different command levels, and while most of the content was in military abbreviations Sarah couldn't decode, one entry was chillingly clear. 0300 hours, Lieutenant Morrison requesting immediate conference with Division Command regarding supply irregularities. Request denied. Lieutenant Morrison placed on restricted communication pending review. 3 days later, according to the official records, Lieutenant Morrison had died heroically while leading a dangerous mission to save his fellow soldiers. But according to this communication log, he had been under military investigation when he died. Emma had grown tired of the toys and was now exploring other areas of the attic, her young voice providing a strange counterpoint to the dark discoveries Sarah was making. "Mummy, there's a whole bunch of medals and ribbons in this box. They're really pretty." Sarah looked over to see her daughter holding what appeared to be military decorations, ribbons and medals that gleamed even in the dim attic light. She carefully took them from Emma's hands, recognizing some of the insignia from history textbooks. These weren't reproductions or commemorative items. These were actual military honors, the kind awarded to high-ranking officers for exceptional service. But why would Aunt Evelyn have someone else's military decorations? Sarah examined them more closely and found small tags attached to each one. Written in Evelyn's familiar handwriting, General Morrison Bronze Star, awarded for action during operation where 47 soldiers died unnecessarily, and Colonel Patterson, Silver Star, received promotion after silencing Lieutenant Morrison. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. These weren't just random military decorations, they were evidence of a systematic conspiracy that had reached the highest levels of military command. Somehow, over the course of decades, Aunt Evelyn had acquired proof that decorated war heroes had built their reputations on the graves of soldiers they had deliberately put in harm's way. As the afternoon wore on and the rain continued to pound against the attic windows, Sarah found herself completely absorbed in what amounted to a comprehensive investigation into military corruption during World War II. Box after box revealed evidence that certain officers had been involved in black market supply operations, deliberately ordering unnecessary missions to eliminate soldiers who had discovered their crimes, and then covering up their actions by painting themselves as heroes and their victims as casualties of war. The most damning evidence was contained in a file folder labeled James's Final Report. Inside, Sarah found what appeared to be a carbon copy of a detailed report written by Lieutenant Morrison just days before his death. The report outlined a systematic operation in which supply officers were selling American military equipment to black market dealers, and then reporting the equipment as lost in combat to cover the theft. According to the report, Lieutenant Morrison had discovered that his own commanding officers, including his father, General Morrison, were not only aware of the black market operation, but were actively profiting from it. When Morrison had threatened to report the crimes to higher military authorities, he had been assigned to increasingly dangerous missions until one finally killed him. The report concluded with a chilling statement. "I fear that my discovery of this criminal conspiracy has placed not only my own life in danger, but the lives of any soldier under my command who might be seen as loyal to me personally rather than to the corrupt officers who run this operation. I am submitting this report in the hope that if something happens to me, the truth will eventually come to light." Sarah leaned back in the desk chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had discovered. This wasn't just family history. This was evidence of war crimes that had been covered up for 70 years. Some of the officers named in these documents had gone on to have distinguished post-war careers, becoming senators, business leaders, and respected elder statesmen whose reputations were built on lies and murder. Emma tugged on her mother's sleeve, bringing Sarah back to the present moment. "Mommy, I'm getting hungry, and it's getting dark outside. Can we go get dinner?" Sarah looked out the dormer window and realized they had been in the attic for hours. The rain had stopped, but twilight was settling over the valley, and they still had a long drive back to the city. But how could she possibly leave this evidence unguarded? How could she walk away from what might be the most important historical discovery in decades? She carefully closed the diary and looked around the attic one more time, realizing that what she had initially seen as a burden had transformed into something else entirely. This wasn't just an inheritance of property and possessions, it was an inheritance of responsibility. Aunt Evelyn had spent her entire adult life gathering evidence of a military conspiracy, waiting for someone who would have the courage to bring the truth to light. As Sarah helped Emma down the steep attic stairs, her mind was already racing with questions. Who could she trust with this information? How could she verify the authenticity of documents that, if genuine, would rewrite military history? And, most importantly, what would happen to her and Emma if the wrong people discovered what they had found? The farmhouse felt different as they gathered their things and prepared to leave. What had seemed like a quaint time capsule now felt like a repository of dangerous secrets. Sarah locked the door behind them, acutely aware that she was now the guardian of evidence that could destroy the reputations of some of America's most celebrated military figures. During the drive back to the city, Emma fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from their day of exploration. Sarah drove through the darkness, her mind churning over the implications of what they had discovered. She thought about Aunt Evelyn, spending decades alone on that farm, carefully preserving evidence that no one had been willing to hear while she was alive. By the time they reached their small apartment, Sarah had made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She couldn't simply sell the farmhouse and walk away from what Aunt Evelyn had entrusted to her. The truth that had been buried for 70 years deserved to see the light, no matter what the personal cost might be. Sarah barely slept that night, her mind replaying every detail from the attic discovery. Emma had fallen asleep easily, clutching the porcelain doll they'd brought home. But Sarah found herself pacing their small apartment at 3 in the morning, wrestling with questions that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. How many families had spent 70 years believing their loved ones died as heroes, never knowing they had actually been murdered to protect a conspiracy? The next morning brought harsh reality crashing back. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her landlord, Mr. Kowalski, reminding her that the eviction notice still stood regardless of any inheritance she might have received. Emma needed new school clothes. Their car was making concerning noises that probably meant expensive repairs, and Sarah's shift at the diner started in 2 hours. The extraordinary discovery in Aunt Evelyn's attic felt almost surreal in the face of such mundane but pressing concerns. Yet as Sarah made Emma's breakfast and helped her get ready for school, she couldn't shake the image of that diary, those carefully preserved documents, the decades of meticulous investigation that Aunt Evelyn had conducted in isolation. How many nights had her great-aunt sat at that small desk in the attic, writing by lamplight, knowing she possessed evidence that could change history, but having no one willing to listen. During her lunch break at the diner, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of scrolling through social media or catching up on celebrity gossip like she usually did, she pulled out her phone and began researching military history. She started with General Morrison, the celebrated war hero who, according to Aunt Evelyn's evidence, had actually been a criminal and murderer. What she found online painted a picture of American military royalty. General Morrison had indeed been one of the most decorated officers of World War II, credited with numerous strategic victories and beloved by the men under his command. After the war, he had served as an advisor to presidents, helped establish NATO protocols, and died in 1987 with a state funeral attended by dignitaries from around the world. Multiple military bases bore his name, and his biography was required reading at West Point. But as Sarah dug deeper, she began noticing gaps in his official biography that aligned disturbingly with Aunt Evelyn's timeline. The period when Lieutenant James Morrison had supposedly died heroically was covered in his father's official records with unusual brevity. Most of General Morrison's other military operations were documented extensively, with detailed after-action reports and multiple witness testimonies. But the specific battles where his son and other questioning soldiers had died were described in vague terms, with minimal supporting documentation. Sarah's research was interrupted by her manager calling her back to work, but during the afternoon rush, she found herself distracted, thinking about patterns and inconsistencies rather than focusing on orders and tips. When a customer mentioned he was a veteran, Sarah found herself studying his face, wondering what secrets he might carry, what truths he might have witnessed that never made it into official reports. After her shift ended, Sarah picked up Emma from the after-school program and made another decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Instead of heading home to their cramped apartment, she drove back toward Millbrook Valley. Emma was delighted by the unexpected adventure, chattering excitedly about returning to the treasure house and asking if they could bring the porcelain doll more friends from the attic. This time, Sarah approached the farmhouse with purpose rather than reluctant obligation. She had stopped at an office supply store and purchased several large plastic storage containers, file folders, and a digital camera. If she was going to understand what Aunt Evelyn had discovered, she needed to organize the evidence systematically and create backup copies of everything. The attic felt different in the evening light, filtering through the dormer windows. What had seemed mysterious and overwhelming the day before now appeared manageable, like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Sarah set Emma up with books and toys in one corner while she began the methodical process of cataloguing Aunt Evelyn's investigation. She started with the diary, reading it chronologically from the beginning and taking careful notes about dates, names, and specific allegations. What emerged was the portrait of a woman transformed by grief into a determined investigator. The early entries showed Evelyn struggling with disbelief and heartbreak, but gradually her writing became more analytical, more focused on facts and evidence rather than emotion. By 1945, Evelyn's entries read like professional intelligence reports. She had developed a network of contacts among military families, veterans, and even some active duty personnel who shared her suspicions about corruption in certain units. Her investigation had expanded far beyond her personal loss to encompass a systematic analysis of suspicious deaths, unearned promotions, and supply irregularities across multiple military operations. One entry from late 1945 particularly caught Sarah's attention. Received letter today from Sergeant Williams, who served under Colonel Patterson during the period when James died. He confirms that Lieutenant Morrison had been asking questions about supply discrepancies and had been scheduled for transfer to a desk assignment just before being suddenly reassigned to the fatal mission. Williams believes the transfer was cancelled specifically to put James in harm's way. Sarah photographed each page of the diary with her phone, ensuring she would have digital copies even if something happened to the originals. As she worked, Emma played quietly nearby, occasionally asking questions about the old photographs or showing her mother particularly interesting items she discovered in the various boxes. The correspondence files proved even more revealing than the diary. Aunt Evelyn had been remarkably persistent in her efforts to bring attention to her discoveries. She had written to military investigators, congressional representatives, newspaper editors, and even presidents, always receiving either form letter dismissals or warnings to cease her inquiries. But some of the letters she had received suggested that her investigation had hit uncomfortably close to the truth. A 1947 letter from a military attorney was particularly ominous. Miss Cartwright, your continued attempts to malign the reputation of decorated war heroes through unsubstantiated allegations has come to the attention of parties who are prepared to take legal action to protect the honor of men who served their country with distinction. You are advised to cease these activities immediately. More disturbing were the personal letters from other military families who had initially shared information with Evelyn, but then suddenly stopped corresponding. Several sent brief notes asking her never to contact them again, with phrasing that suggested they had been pressured or threatened into silence. One letter from 1948 particularly chilled Sarah. Dear Miss Cartwright, I cannot continue our correspondence regarding my husband's death. Circumstances have changed in ways that make further discussion impossible. I have been offered a generous widow's pension that will ensure my children's education, contingent upon my agreement to never discuss the details of my husband's service or death. I'm sure you understand that my children's welfare must come first. Sarah realized she was witnessing the systematic silencing of anyone who might corroborate Aunt Evelyn's evidence. The conspiracy hadn't just covered up crimes. It had methodically eliminated potential witnesses through a combination of bribes and threats that had been devastatingly effective. As the evening progressed, Sarah organized the evidence into categories: personnel files, communication logs, witness testimonies, financial records, and what appeared to be stolen or leaked official documents. The scope of Aunt Evelyn's investigation was staggering. She had somehow obtained internal military communications, classified after-action reports, and even financial records showing unusual payments to officers' bank accounts during the periods when the alleged crimes had occurred. Emma had fallen asleep on a pile of vintage quilts she had discovered in one of the trunks, her small form peaceful among the accumulated secrets of 7 decades. Sarah covered her daughter with a soft throw and continued working by lamplight, feeling a strange connection to Aunt Evelyn, who had spent countless nights in this same space, pursuing truth despite the personal cost. One file folder labeled Modern Connections proved to contain the most potentially explosive information. Aunt Evelyn had apparently continued her investigation well into the 1980s, tracking how the conspirators and their families had leveraged the war records into post-conflict success. Several had become senators, cabinet members, and business leaders. Their children and grandchildren had inherited not just wealth and social position, but also the burden of protecting secrets that could destroy their families' legacies. A family tree diagram showed connections between the original conspirators and current political and business leaders that read like a who's who of American power brokers. If Aunt Evelyn's evidence was accurate, some of the country's most influential families had built their empires on foundations of murder and theft. Sarah found a letter dated just 6 months before Aunt Evelyn's death that suggested she had been planning to finally reveal her discoveries. It was addressed to a producer at a major television network known for investigative journalism. Dear Mr. Hendricks, after 45 years of research, I believe I have assembled conclusive evidence of war crimes and conspiracy that reach to the highest levels of American military and political leadership. I'm prepared to share this evidence publicly, but I need assurances of protection for both myself and the documentation I have preserved." There was no response letter in the files, suggesting that either the producer had never replied or that Aunt Evelyn had died before the correspondence could continue. Sarah felt a surge of anger at the thought that Aunt Evelyn might have taken this monumental secret to her grave, defeated by the same forces that had silenced her for decades. But then Sarah realized that Aunt Evelyn hadn't taken the secret to her grave. She had carefully preserved everything, organized it meticulously, and left it for someone else to discover, someone who might have the courage and resources to finish what she had started. As Sarah continued reading through the files, she discovered that Aunt Evelyn had been remarkably prescient about the challenges of exposing powerful conspiracies. In the letter never sent, dated 1979, she had written, "The evidence I have assembled would be dismissed by authorities as the obsession of a bitter spinster if presented by me alone. The conspirators have had decades to build their defenses, create alternative narratives, and position themselves beyond the reach of conventional justice. Whoever inherits this evidence will need allies, credibility, and most importantly, the ability to present it in a way that cannot be ignored or suppressed." Sarah felt the weight of that responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was a single mother who worked at a diner, struggling to pay rent and keep food on the table. What possible credibility could she have in challenging some of America's most revered military heroes? How could she protect herself and Emma from the kind of intimidation that had silenced an entire generation of potential witnesses? But as she looked at her sleeping daughter, surrounded by evidence of a 70-year-old conspiracy, Sarah felt something stronger than fear beginning to grow inside her. Emma deserved to grow up in a world where truth mattered more than power, where justice was possible even against overwhelming odds. If Sarah didn't have the courage to speak up now, what kind of example would she be setting for her daughter? Around midnight, Sarah made a decision that would change both their lives. She carefully photographed every document in the collection, uploaded the images to secure cloud storage, and began drafting an email to every investigative journalist, military historian, and government accountability organization she could find online. She wouldn't wait for permission or validation. She would start sharing Aunt Evelyn's evidence immediately before anyone could stop her. But as she composed her first email, a sound from outside made her freeze. A car engine running quietly in the distance but gradually getting closer. Sarah realized that their car was the only one that should be on this isolated country road at this hour. She turned off the attic lights and moved carefully to one of the dormer windows. Through the darkness, she could see headlights moving slowly up the road toward the farmhouse. The vehicle stopped at the property line, its lights illuminating the house for several long minutes before finally turning around and driving away. Someone had been checking to see if anyone was at the farmhouse, and Sarah had a sinking feeling that their return visit hadn't gone unnoticed. She gently woke Emma and gathered their things, her heart pounding as she realized they might not be as safe as she had assumed. But as they quietly left the farmhouse and drove back toward the city, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that transcended her personal struggles. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of bringing Aunt Evelyn's evidence to light. She would find allies, build credibility, and honor the memory of a woman who had spent her entire adult life pursuing justice against impossible odds. The conspiracy that had silenced one generation of truth-tellers was about to face a new kind of opponent, a mother who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. For the first time since her divorce, since losing her job at the accounting firm, since struggling to provide for Emma as a single parent, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Aunt Evelyn's inheritance wasn't just property and possessions. It was a mission that would give meaning to every challenge Sarah had faced and every sacrifice she had made. The evidence was overwhelming, the implications staggering, and the opposition would be formidable. But Sarah Martinez was about to prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who simply refuse to stay silent when staying silent would be easier. The next morning brought Sarah's first taste of what she was truly up against. Her email inbox, which she had filled with carefully crafted messages to journalists and historians the night before, contained a series of responses that chilled her to the bone. Not rejections or requests for more information, but something far more sinister. Automated replies stating that the recipient's email accounts had been temporarily suspended for security reasons. Every single person she had contacted had mysteriously lost access to their email within hours of receiving her message. The coincidence was impossible to ignore and terrifying to contemplate. Someone with serious technological resources was monitoring communications about military corruption, and they moved fast to shut down any potential investigations. Sarah sat in her car outside Emma's school, staring at her phone screen with growing determination rather than fear. The immediate silencing of her contacts proved that Aunt Evelyn's evidence was not only genuine, but represented a threat serious enough to warrant active suppression. This wasn't paranoia or conspiracy theory. This was proof that powerful forces were still working to protect secrets that should have died with the original conspirators. But Sarah had grown up in the digital age, and she understood something that the people trying to silence her might not have fully grasped. Information wanted to be free, and in the internet era, it was almost impossible to completely suppress truth when someone was determined to share it. She just needed to be smarter about how she approached the problem. Instead of going to work at the diner, Sarah called in sick and drove to the public library, where she could use computers that weren't connected to her personal accounts. She had spent her lunch break the day before researching not just General Morrison's official biography, but also contemporary military historians who specialized in World War II controversies. She was looking for people who had already demonstrated a willingness to challenge accepted narratives about the war. At the library, she created anonymous email accounts and began reaching out to academics whose work suggested they might be receptive to explosive new evidence. But this time, she was more strategic. Instead of sending the full scope of Aunt Evelyn's discoveries, she shared just one document, Lieutenant James Morrison's final report about the black market operation. Dr. Rebecca Chen at Georgetown University responded within an hour. Her email was brief but electrifying. If this document is authentic, it represents potentially the most significant military history discovery in decades. I need to examine the original and verify its provenance. Can you meet me tomorrow? Professor Michael Torres at the University of California had a similar reaction. I've been researching irregular supply operations during the European theater for 15 years. This report fills in gaps that have puzzled historians for generations. We need to talk immediately. Most importantly, Dr. Jennifer Walsh at the National Military Archives responded with information that made Sarah's hands shake as she read, I've seen references to a classified investigation into the 82nd Battalion's final missions, but the files were sealed indefinitely. This report suggests why they never wanted that investigation to become public. I'm willing to help you navigate the authentication process. But you need to understand that some people will go to extreme lengths to keep this information buried. Sarah realized she was no longer alone in this fight. Aunt Evelyn had spent decades in isolation, but Sarah was building a network of allies with the expertise and credibility to make her evidence impossible to dismiss. For the first time since discovering the diary, she felt hope beginning to overshadow fear. Her confidence was shaken when she arrived home to find her landlord, Mr. Kowalski, waiting in the parking lot with an expression that mixed sympathy with obvious discomfort. He approached her car before she could even turn off the engine, and his first words confirmed her worst suspicions. "Sarah, I'm sorry, but I've received an offer to buy your lease from a property management company. They're willing to pay me 6 months of your rent in advance if I agree to terminate your tenancy immediately." Sarah felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in, the same feeling she'd experienced during her divorce when her ex-husband's lawyer had systematically destroyed her financial stability through legal maneuvering. But this time was different. This time she understood that the pressure was confirmation she was on the right track. "Mr. Kowalski, you know me. You know Emma. We've been good tenants for 3 years. Why would a property management company suddenly be interested in our specific apartment?" The older man's discomfort was obvious. "They said they're upgrading all the units in this building, but they're only offering buyouts for certain leases. Yours was specifically mentioned." Sarah thanked him and asked for 24 hours to consider her options. But inside she was already calculating her next moves. Someone was using financial pressure to disrupt her life, just as they had done to military families in the 1940s. The tactics had been refined over 7 decades, but the fundamental approach remained the same: isolate the threat and make the cost of resistance higher than the cost of silence. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible. Just a week earlier, she called her supervisor at the diner and gave 2 weeks' notice, then began researching temporary housing options near Millbrook Valley. If powerful interests wanted to disrupt her established life, she would make herself harder to target by becoming less predictable. Emma took the news with the resilience that never failed to amaze Sarah. When told they would be spending more time at the treasure house and potentially moving to the country, her daughter's primary concern was whether she could bring her new favorite doll and if there were good schools in the area. "Mommy, are we going on an adventure like in the movies?" Emma asked as they packed essential belongings that night. "The biggest adventure of our lives, baby. We're going to help Great Aunt Evelyn finish something very important that she started a long time ago." Emma nodded solemnly, as if she understood the gravity of their situation better than an 8-year-old should. "Is it dangerous like in the movies too?" Sarah paused in her packing, looking at her daughter's trusting face. "Some people don't want us to tell the truth about things that happened before you were born. They might try to scare us or make things difficult, but we're going to be very careful, and we're going to help each other be brave." The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of activity that left Sarah simultaneously exhausted and energized. She met with Dr. Chen in Washington, where they spent hours examining photocopies of Aunt Evelyn's documents, while the professor's graduate students ran preliminary authentication tests. The results were encouraging. The paper, ink, and typewriter fonts all appeared consistent with 1940s military correspondence. Professor Torres flew in from California specifically to examine the supply operation records, and his expertise in logistics and military procurement made him an invaluable ally. He was able to identify specific irregularities in the documented transactions that aligned perfectly with known black market operations from the period. But it was Dr. Walsh from the National Military Archives who provided the breakthrough that transformed Sarah's evidence from historical curiosity to potential criminal case. She had spent the week using her security clearance to access classified files related to the 82nd Battalion, and what she found corroborated Aunt Evelyn's evidence in ways that made cover-up impossible to deny. The official investigation into supply irregularities was terminated abruptly in November 1943, Dr. Walsh explained during their meeting at a coffee shop near the National Archives. The termination order came from the highest levels of military command, specifically citing national security concerns. But I found something else in the files. A memo suggesting that evidence had been deliberately destroyed to protect ongoing operations. Sarah leaned forward intently. What kind of evidence? Communication logs, financial records, witness statements, everything that might have exposed the scope of the conspiracy. But here's the thing. Your great-aunt's collection contains copies of some of those supposedly destroyed documents. She somehow obtained evidence that the military thought had been eliminated forever. The implication was staggering. Aunt Evelyn hadn't just stumbled onto evidence of military corruption. She had preserved proof of a systematic cover-up that reached the highest levels of government. Her decades of isolation hadn't been the product of grief-induced delusion. They had been necessary protection for evidence that certain people would kill to suppress. Dr. Walsh continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I've been doing this work for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. If we can authenticate these documents and present them properly, we're talking about the biggest military scandal in American history. But Sarah, you need to understand that some of the families implicated still have enormous influence. They won't just try to discredit you, they'll try to destroy you. That afternoon, Sarah returned to the farmhouse with a team of experts and enough equipment to properly document everything in Aunt Evelyn's collection. Dr. Chen brought professional photography equipment and archival supplies. Professor Torres arrived with military logistics specialists, and Dr. Walsh came with a portable scanner capable of creating museum-quality digital reproductions. Emma spent the day exploring the main house with Dr. Chen's graduate student, who had volunteered to serve as babysitter in exchange for the chance to witness what she called the most significant historical discovery of our generation. For Emma, it was simply another day at the treasure house, but for the adults it was the beginning of a process that would reshape understanding of World War II. Working systematically through Aunt Evelyn's collection, the team uncovered evidence that exceeded even Sarah's expectations. The black market operation had been just one aspect of a larger conspiracy involving falsified battle reports, deliberately engineered military disasters designed to eliminate troublesome personnel, and a post-war cover-up that had protected the conspirators for decades. Most damning were the financial records showing how stolen military supplies had been converted into personal wealth that funded the conspirators' post-war political and business careers. Several prominent American political dynasties could trace their origins to fortunes built on equipment meant for American soldiers fighting for their lives in Europe. But as the team worked, Sarah noticed something troubling. Cars had been passing the farmhouse more frequently than seemed normal for such a remote road. Some slowed down as they passed, and she caught glimpses of passengers taking photographs of the vehicles parked outside. By evening, she was certain they were being watched. Dr. Walsh confirmed her suspicions. I've been monitoring communications about our research through back channels. There's definitely awareness at high levels that something significant is happening here. We need to accelerate our timeline and get this evidence into multiple secure locations immediately. That night, while Emma slept in the guest room surrounded by her collection of dolls and toys, Sarah and her allies worked until dawn, creating multiple backup copies of every document, photograph, and piece of evidence in Aunt Evelyn's collection. They uploaded encrypted files to servers in different countries, mailed physical copies to safety deposit boxes in multiple states, and prepared comprehensive documentation packages for journalists, prosecutors, and military investigators. Professor Torres made an observation that crystallized the magnitude of what they were attempting. We're not just challenging historical interpretation. We're threatening the foundational narratives that some of America's most powerful families have built their identities around. This isn't academic research anymore. It's warfare. Sarah understood that he was right. But she also understood something equally important. They had already passed the point of no return. The evidence was too compelling, too well documented, and now too widely distributed to be suppressed through traditional intimidation tactics. Aunt Evelyn's 70-year investigation was finally going to see the light of day. As dawn broke over Millbrook Valley, Sarah stood on the farmhouse porch with Emma, watching the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Her daughter pointed excitedly at a hawk circling overhead, marveling at how its wings caught the morning light. "Mommy, do you think Great Aunt Evelyn would be happy that we found her treasures?" Sarah hugged her daughter close, thinking about the remarkable woman who had spent decades alone in this house, preserving truth despite overwhelming opposition. "I think she would be very proud of us, baby, and I think she's finally going to get the justice she worked so hard for." The previous week, Sarah had been a struggling single mother facing eviction and wondering how she would provide for her daughter's future. Now, she was at the center of a historical investigation that would reshape understanding of America's most celebrated military heroes. The transformation wasn't just in her circumstances. It was in her understanding of her own capacity for courage and determination. As they prepared to leave the farmhouse for what might be the last peaceful day they would have for a long time, Sarah felt Aunt Evelyn's presence not as a ghost from the past, but as an inspiration for the future. One woman's refusal to accept convenient lies had preserved truth for 70 years. Now another woman would ensure that truth finally prevailed, no matter what forces aligned against them. The battle for justice was about to begin in earnest, and Sarah Martinez was ready to finish what Evelyn Cartwright had started so many decades ago. The confrontation Sarah had been dreading came sooner than expected, but not in the way she had anticipated. Instead of shadowy figures or legal threats, it arrived in the form of a distinguished gentleman in his 70s who knocked politely on the farmhouse door while Sarah and Emma were having breakfast in Aunt Evelyn's sunny kitchen. "Miss Martinez, I'm Richard Morrison, and I believe we need to have a conversation about some documents you've recently discovered." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Morrison, the name that appeared throughout Aunt Evelyn's evidence as both victim and perpetrator. This had to be a descendant of the conspiracy, someone with a personal stake in keeping the truth buried. She instinctively moved Emma behind her as she opened the door wider to get a better look at their unexpected visitor. The man was impeccably dressed in a way that suggested old money and political connections. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his shoes were hand-polished leather, and his manner radiated the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of having doors opened rather than closed. But his eyes held something Sarah hadn't expected, genuine sadness rather than threat. "I'm not here to intimidate you, Ms. Martinez. Quite the opposite, actually. I'm here because I've spent 50 years wondering if someone would eventually discover what my grandfather really did during the war." Sarah's hand remained on the door handle, ready to slam it shut if necessary. "Your grandfather?" "General Robert Morrison, the war hero whose reputation was built on my great-uncle James's murder." Richard's voice carried decades of suppressed anguish. "I've been waiting my entire adult life for someone to find evidence that would finally allow me to tell the truth about my family's history." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. This wasn't a descendant of the conspirators coming to silence her. This was a descendant of the victims coming to help her. She invited Richard inside, her mind racing, to process this unexpected development. Emma, with the fearlessness of childhood, immediately engaged Richard in conversation about the old photographs on Aunt Evelyn's mantelpiece. She pointed to a picture of Lieutenant James Morrison in his military uniform and asked if Richard knew the handsome soldier in the picture. "That's my great-uncle James," Richard said gently, kneeling to Emma's level. "He was a very brave man who tried to do the right thing, even when it was dangerous." As Emma wandered off to play with her dolls, Richard turned to Sarah with an expression of profound relief. "I can't tell you what it means to finally meet someone who knows the truth. I've carried this burden my entire life, knowing my family's fortune and reputation were built on blood money and lies." Richard explained that he had grown up hearing whispered family stories that contradicted the official narrative about his grandfather's military heroism. His grandmother, General Morrison's wife, had lived with the knowledge that her husband had orchestrated their son's death to protect his criminal enterprises. She had shared fragments of the truth with Richard's father, who had passed the burden on to the next generation. "We've been prisoners of his legacy for 3 generations, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every political connection, every business opportunity, every social advantage we've enjoyed has been tainted by the knowledge that it was purchased with the lives of American soldiers. I became a military historian, specifically hoping to find evidence that would allow me to expose what really happened." Sarah studied his face carefully, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. Her experience with her ex-husband had taught her to be suspicious of men who appeared too good to be true. But Richard's pain seemed genuine, and his next revelation convinced her of his sincerity. "I've been funding my own investigation for 20 years, following the same trails your great-aunt explored. I know about the other families, the cover-up, the post-war conspiracy. What I never had was documentary evidence that could stand up to legal scrutiny." He paused, looking directly at Sarah. "What you've found in this house could finally free us all from the lies." Over the next several hours, Richard shared information that filled in crucial gaps in Aunt Evelyn's investigation. As a Morrison family member, he had access to private family documents, financial records, and personal correspondence that corroborated every aspect of the conspiracy. More importantly, he had connections within the military establishment who had been waiting decades for someone with credible evidence to come forward. "There's a group of military historians, prosecutors, and even some current Pentagon officials who have suspected the truth for years," Richard explained, "but they needed proof that couldn't be dismissed as speculation or vendetta. What your great-aunt preserved, combined with what I can provide from the family archives, creates an unassailable case." The alliance that formed that morning transformed everything about Sarah's situation. Richard's credibility as a military historian and Morrison family member made it impossible for their enemies to dismiss the evidence as the delusions of a grieving woman or the attention-seeking behavior of a struggling single mother. His connections provided access to legal and media resources that Sarah could never have reached on her own. But most importantly, Richard brought something Sarah hadn't expected to find: proof that choosing courage over comfort could inspire others to do the same. His decision to expose his own family's crimes demonstrated that integrity was more powerful than inherited privilege, that truth was more valuable than reputation. Dr. Chen, Professor Torres, and Dr. Walsh arrived that afternoon to find their small team had grown into something resembling a war council. Richard had contacted allies across the country, and the Farmhouse kitchen became command central for what was rapidly developing into a coordinated campaign to expose 70 years of military corruption. The breakthrough came when Dr. Walsh received a phone call from a contact at the Department of Justice. Someone with significant authority had been monitoring their research and was prepared to provide official protection for their investigation. Within hours, federal marshals arrived at the farmhouse, not to arrest anyone, but to ensure their safety while they completed their documentation. "This is bigger than any of us realized," explained Deputy Marshal Patricia Hawkins as she briefed the team on security protocols. "We've been tracking suspicious activity related to your research, and there are indications that some people are prepared to go to extreme lengths to prevent this information from becoming public. The federal protection allowed them to work with unprecedented speed and thoroughness. Richard provided access to Morrison family financial records that showed exactly how stolen military supplies had been converted into the investments that funded generations of political influence. Dr. Chen's authentication tests confirmed that every document in Aunt Evelyn's collection was genuine. Professor Torres mapped the scope of the black market operation across multiple theaters of war. Most dramatically, Dr. Walsh used her security clearance to declassify related documents that had been sealed for decades. The Pentagon, faced with irrefutable evidence of historical crimes, chose cooperation over continued cover-up. Military officials who had spent careers wondering about inconsistencies in World War II records finally had permission to share what they had suspected for decades. Emma adapted to the chaos with remarkable resilience, treating the arrival of federal marshals and university professors as an extension of her adventure at the treasure house. She befriended Deputy Marshal Hawkins, who taught her card games during breaks in the investigation, and helped Dr. Chen organize photographs by asking questions that sometimes led to important discoveries. "Mommy, why does the man in this picture look sad, even though he's getting a medal?" Emma asked during one of their evening sessions, pointing to a photograph of General Morrison receiving a commendation shortly after his son's death. Sarah looked at the image with new eyes, seeing what her daughter's innocent observation had revealed, guilt and grief barely concealed behind a facade of military pride. Even in his moment of public triumph, General Morrison had been unable to completely pay the cost of his crimes. The media strategy they developed was unprecedented in its scope and coordination. Rather than relying on a single news outlet that could be pressured or discredited, they prepared simultaneous releases through military publications, academic journals, major newspapers, and investigative television programs. The story would break simultaneously across multiple platforms, making suppression impossible. Richard proved invaluable in anticipating and countering the inevitable attempts to discredit their evidence. His family connections allowed him to predict which arguments would be used to defend General Morrison's reputation, and his military expertise helped them prepare responses to every potential challenge. "They'll claim the documents are forgeries," he warned during one of their planning sessions. "They'll say Aunt Evelyn was mentally unstable. They'll argue that wartime conditions made irregular activities understandable. They'll question your motives, Sarah, suggesting you're seeking attention or financial gain. But they were prepared for every attack. Authentication tests from multiple independent laboratories confirmed the document's authenticity. Medical records proved that Aunt Evelyn had been of sound mind throughout her investigation. Military experts verified that the described activities constituted clear violations of military law, regardless of wartime circumstances. And Sarah's financial situation made it obvious that profit was not her motivation. The personal cost of their investigation became clear when Richard received a phone call from his elderly mother, who had been contacted by family friends, suggesting he was making a terrible mistake that would destroy the Morrison legacy forever. Similar pressure was applied to Dr. Chen's university department and Professor Torres's research funding. Someone with significant influence was working systematically to isolate and discredit their team, but the pressure only strengthened their resolve. Sarah found herself becoming a more confident public speaker as she prepared for the media interviews that would accompany their revelations. Richard's decision to publicly acknowledge his family's crimes inspired other descendants of the conspirators to come forward with additional evidence. The investigation that had begun with one woman's discovery was growing into a movement that would reshape understanding of American military history. Emma played a crucial role in maintaining morale during the most stressful periods of their work. Her excitement about their important mission reminded the adults that they were fighting for future generations who deserved to inherit truth rather than comfortable lies. When Sarah occasionally wavered under the pressure, Emma's innocent questions about justice and fairness reinforced her commitment to seeing their mission through to completion. The night before their coordinated media release, Sarah stood in Aunt Evelyn's attic one final time, looking at the desk where her great-aunt had spent decades pursuing justice in isolation. The space felt different now, charged with anticipation rather than lonely determination. Tomorrow, Aunt Evelyn's life work would finally reach the audience it deserved. Richard joined her in the attic, both of them reflecting on how dramatically their lives had changed since Sarah's discovery of the diary. "Do you think she knew?" he asked quietly. "Do you think Aunt Evelyn somehow knew that her investigation would eventually connect our families in pursuit of the same truth?" Sarah touched the worn leather of the diary that had started everything. "I think she knew that truth has its own momentum. She couldn't force justice to happen in her lifetime, but she could preserve the evidence for someone who would have the courage and resources to finish what she started." They stood in comfortable silence, two people from different worlds united by their commitment to honoring the sacrifice of a remarkable woman who had never given up hope that justice would eventually prevail. Tomorrow would bring challenges neither of them could fully anticipate, but they faced the future with the confidence that comes from knowing you're fighting for something larger than yourself. Emma's voice drifted up from downstairs, where she was helping Deputy Marshal Hawkins. "Prepare hot chocolate for everyone. Mommy, is tomorrow when we tell the whole world about Great-Aunt Evelyn's treasures?" "Yes, baby," Sarah called back. "Tomorrow, the whole world learns about the treasures that were hidden for 70 years. As they prepared to leave the attic, Sarah felt Aunt Evelyn's presence one final time, not as a ghost, but as a benediction. The lonely vigil was over. The truth was about to be free, and the woman who had preserved it through decades of opposition would finally receive the vindication she had earned through her unwavering commitment to justice. The inheritance that had seemed like a burden just 2 weeks earlier had revealed itself to be the greatest gift Sarah had ever received, the opportunity to complete a mission that would honor the past, serve the present, and protect the future. Tomorrow, the world would learn that some truths are too important to remain buried, no matter how long it takes for them to see the light. The morning of their coordinated media release dawned clear and crisp, with autumn sunlight streaming through the farmhouse windows in a way that seemed to bless their mission. Sarah woke to find Emma already dressed and sitting at Aunt Evelyn's kitchen table, carefully arranging her collection of dolls, as if they were an audience waiting for an important announcement. "Today's the day we make Great-Aunt Evelyn famous, isn't it, Mommy?" Emma asked, with the kind of pure excitement that only children could bring to world-changing events. Sarah nodded, feeling a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that reminded her of her college graduation day, when endless possibilities had stretched ahead of her. But this was bigger than personal achievement. This was about fundamentally changing how America understood its own history. Richard arrived early, accompanied by a woman Sarah hadn't met before. Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee. The senator's presence transformed the farmhouse kitchen into something resembling a war room, complete with secure phones, laptops, and stacks of documentation that would reshape military historiography. "Ms. Martinez," Senator Williams said, extending her hand with a firm grip that conveyed both respect and determination. "What you've uncovered here represents one of the most significant intelligence discoveries in decades. Congress has been waiting 70 years for evidence this comprehensive." The senator explained that their investigation had triggered a broader review of classified military records, revealing a pattern of corruption that extended far beyond General Morrison's conspiracy. Multiple congressional committees were preparing investigations into historical military crimes, defense contractor fraud, and the systematic cover-up of evidence that should have been made public decades ago. Your great-aunt's work didn't just expose one conspiracy, Senator Williams continued, studying the organized evidence that covered every surface of the kitchen. She documented the blueprint for how military-industrial corruption operates, how it protects itself, and how it perpetuates across generations. This information will inform anti-corruption efforts for decades to come. The media response exceeded even their most optimistic projections. Dr. Chen coordinated with television producers who had moved up their broadcast schedules to accommodate the breaking story. Professor Torres worked with military publications, whose editors recognized they were witnessing the most important military history revelation since the Pentagon Papers. Dr. Walsh managed relationships with government officials who were grateful to finally address historical injustices that had haunted institutional memory for generations. But it was Richard's decision to appear on camera as a Morrison family member that provided the emotional impact their story needed to reach beyond academic circles. His willingness to publicly acknowledge his grandfather's crimes, forfeit his family's unearned reputation, and support prosecution of historical war crimes demonstrated a level of moral courage that resonated with audiences across political divides. I could have lived my entire life enjoying the benefits of my grandfather's stolen valor, Richard said during his first television interview, sitting in Aunt Evelyn's living room surrounded by the evidence she had preserved. But enjoying privileges built on the graves of murdered American soldiers would have made me complicit in his crimes. Some legacies are too toxic to inherit. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Military families whose relatives had died under suspicious circumstances during World War II began contacting news organizations with their own stories. Veterans who had witnessed irregular activities but been silenced by military authorities found their voices after decades of enforced silence. Historians who had suspected cover-ups but lacked evidence suddenly had a framework for understanding anomalies that had puzzled them for years. Emma became an unexpected media sensation when a photographer captured her playing with vintage dolls while surrounded by federal marshals and university professors. The image, which appeared on front pages across the country, perfectly captured the generational aspect of their story. A child representing the future, surrounded by adults working to correct the mistakes of the past. Sarah found herself transformed, from struggling single mother to reluctant public figure, as interview requests poured in from around the world. International media organizations recognized that the story had global implications, revealing how military corruption operated during America's most celebrated conflict and raising questions about similar cover-ups in other countries. The backlash came swiftly and predictably, but it arrived with less force than their team had anticipated. Several prominent political figures who traced their family fortunes to the Morrison conspiracy issued statements defending their ancestors' reputations, but their arguments sounded hollow when presented alongside Aunt Evelyn's meticulously documented evidence. More significantly, the attempt to discredit their findings backfired spectacularly when it became clear that some of the most vociferous defenders had been aware of their families' criminal histories for decades. Their desperate attempts to suppress the truth only confirmed its accuracy and highlighted the ongoing conspiracy to protect war criminals. Dr. Chen received death threats from anonymous sources, but they only strengthened academic support for her work. Universities across the country issued statements defending historical research and condemning attempts to intimidate scholars. The threats also triggered FBI investigations into ongoing criminal conspiracies to obstruct justice and intimidate federal witnesses. Professor Torres discovered that his research funding was being threatened by defense contractors with historical connections to the original conspiracy. But Congress immediately launched investigations into improper influence over academic research. The attempt to silence him exposed a contemporary network of corruption that validated everything Aunt Evelyn had suspected about the persistence of military-industrial crime. Sarah's personal story resonated particularly strongly with single mothers who saw her transformation from struggling parent to national figure as proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept injustice. Her speaking engagements began drawing audiences who came not just to learn about military history, but to be inspired by her example of courage under pressure. Emma thrived in their new circumstances, adapting to life in the national spotlight. With remarkable poise, she became a favorite of journalists who discovered that her innocent questions often led to profound insights about justice, family responsibility, and the importance of telling difficult truths. Why did it take so long for grown-ups to tell the truth about the bad soldiers? Emma asked during one televised interview, a question that prompted a national conversation about institutional failures and the courage required to challenge powerful interests. The legal ramifications of their discoveries extended far beyond historical justice. The evidence Aunt Evelyn had preserved triggered investigations into contemporary military contractors whose founding families had profited from the original conspiracy. Several major defense companies faced congressional investigations, federal audits, and civil lawsuits from veterans organizations. More importantly, Congress passed legislation requiring declassification of historical military records that had been sealed to protect criminals rather than national security. The Evelyn Cartwright Transparency Act established new protocols for historical accountability and created legal protections for researchers investigating military misconduct. Richard's decision to donate his inherited wealth to veterans organizations created a powerful example of how individuals could take responsibility for their family's historical crimes. His announcement that he was establishing the Lieutenant James Morrison Foundation for Military Ethics inspired other descendants of the conspirators to acknowledge their families' crimes and make amends through charitable giving and support. For veterans' causes, the international impact of their story proved even more significant than its domestic effects. Military historians in Allied countries began re-examining their own World War II records, discovering similar patterns of corruption and cover-up. The documentation techniques Aunt Evelyn had developed became templates for investigating historical military crimes worldwide. Sarah found herself invited to speak at international conferences on military accountability, historical justice, and the protection of whistleblowers. Her transformation from small-town diner waitress to global advocate for military transparency inspired audiences around the world and demonstrated that moral courage could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. Emma's education became a collaborative effort involving the team of experts who had helped expose the conspiracy. Dr. Chen taught her about historical research methods. Professor Torres explained military logistics and ethics. Dr. Walsh showed her how government archives preserve truth for future generations. And Richard shared lessons about taking responsibility for family history. Emma's getting the kind of education most children never receive, Deputy Marshal Hawkins observed. During one of their security briefings, she's learning firsthand that individuals can change history when they have the courage to act on their convictions. The farmhouse itself became a pilgrimage site for military families, historians, and advocates for government transparency. Sarah established it as a museum and research center, preserving Aunt Evelyn's attic office exactly as they had found it, while creating educational exhibits about military accountability and the importance of protecting whistleblowers. One year After their first discovery in the attic, Sarah stood before a joint session of Congress to deliver testimony about the ongoing need for military transparency and historical accountability. Emma sat in the gallery, wearing a dress that had belonged to one of Aunt Evelyn's dolls, watching her mother address the most powerful political figures in the country. My great-aunt Evelyn Cartwright spent 70 years preserving evidence that powerful people hoped would disappear, Sarah testified, her voice carrying to every corner of the historic chamber. She died believing that truth was more important than convenience, that justice was worth pursuing even when the odds seemed impossible, and that individual courage could ultimately triumph over institutional corruption. Sarah paused, looking up at Emma in the gallery, then continued with words that would be quoted in history textbooks for generations to come. We inherited more than documents and photographs from Aunt Evelyn. We inherited the responsibility to ensure that truth-tellers are protected, that historical crimes are acknowledged, and that future generations receive honest accounts of their past rather than comfortable lies. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 10 minutes, with senators and representatives from both parties acknowledging that Sarah and her team had fundamentally changed how America understood military accountability. Congressional leaders announced new legislation that would strengthen protections for military whistleblowers and create permanent funding for historical transparency initiatives. Emma joined her mother at the podium for the conclusion of her testimony, representing the generation that would inherit the more honest and accountable military establishment their work had helped create. When asked by a reporter what she had learned from their extraordinary journey, Emma's response captured the essence of their mission with startling clarity. I learned that telling the truth is hard work, but it's the most important work there is. Great Aunt Evelyn taught us that one person who never gives up can change everything, even if it takes a really long time. As they left the Capitol building that day, Sarah reflected on the remarkable transformation that had begun with a reluctant signature on inheritance papers. The struggling single mother who had simply wanted to clear out an old farmhouse had become a national advocate for military transparency and historical accountability. The eviction notice that had once seemed like her worst nightmare had actually been the catalyst that freed her from a life of mere survival and launched her into a mission of profound purpose. Emma's future, which had once seemed limited by financial constraints and social barriers, now stretched ahead filled with possibilities that neither of them could have imagined. Aunt Evelyn's lonely vigil in that farmhouse attic had finally ended, but her legacy would continue through the institutions, laws, and cultural changes their investigation had inspired. The diary that had seemed like simply a family relic had proven to be a blueprint for how individual conscience could ultimately triumph over institutional corruption. That evening, as they returned to the farmhouse that had become their permanent home, Sarah tucked Emma into bed in the same guest room where their adventure had begun. Outside the window, the autumn moon illuminated the valley where Aunt Evelyn had spent decades preserving truth for a future she would never see but had never stopped believing in. "Mommy," Emma whispered as Sarah turned off the light, "do you think there are other treasure houses with important secrets waiting to be found?" Sarah smiled, knowing that their work had inspired countless others to look more carefully at their own family histories, their own inherited responsibilities, and their own capacity for moral courage. "I think there are treasures everywhere, baby. We just have to be brave enough to look for them and strong enough to share them when we find them." The inheritance that had once seemed like a burden had revealed itself to be the greatest gift imaginable. The opportunity to complete a mission that honored the past, served the present, and protected the future. As Sarah fell asleep in Aunt Evelyn's house, She knew that some legacies were too important to remain hidden, no matter how long it took for them to change the world. 5 years after that first discovery in Aunt Evelyn's attic, Sarah Martinez stood before the newly constructed Evelyn Cartwright Center for Military Transparency, watching as the final bronze plaque was installed beside the entrance. The center, built adjacent to the original farmhouse, had become a global hub for military accountability research, hosting scholars from around the world who came to study both historical cover-ups and contemporary transparency initiatives. Emma, now 13, and possessing the confident poise of someone who had grown up at the center of historical change, helped unveil the plaque that read, "Dedicated to Evelyn Cartwright, 1920-2018, and all truth-tellers who preserve evidence of injustice for future generations to discover and address." The dedication ceremony brought together an extraordinary collection of people whose lives had been transformed by their investigation. Richard Morrison, now serving as the center's chief historian, had spent 5 years helping other military families uncover their own buried secrets. Dr. Chen had established a new academic field studying institutional cover-ups across cultures and time periods. Professor Torres had written the definitive textbook on military ethics, used at service academies worldwide. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation belonged to Senator Williams, who had leveraged the Morrison revelations into comprehensive military justice reform. The legislation she had championed, known internationally as the Cartwright Protocols, had been adopted by allied nations as the new standard for military transparency and accountability. Today, we celebrate not just the completion of this remarkable facility, Senator Williams addressed the gathered crowd, but the proof that individual conscience, when supported by institutional courage, can literally change the world. The audience included military families from dozens of countries who had used Aunt Evelyn's documentation methods to uncover their own suppressed histories. Veterans who had spent decades carrying the burden of witnessed atrocities finally had official forums for sharing their testimonies. Historians who had been denied access to classified records now worked with newly transparent military archives. Sarah's journey from struggling single mother to internationally recognized advocate had inspired a global movement of ordinary people investigating extraordinary injustices. The Cartwright Foundation, established with donations from around the world, provided legal protection and financial support for individuals who discovered evidence of institutional corruption in their family histories. Emma had become something of a legend among the children of military families, many of whom sent her letters describing their own discoveries of hidden family documents or suspicious family stories. She maintained correspondence with dozens of young people whose parents were following the example Sarah had set by choosing truth over comfort. "The thing I've learned from all these letters," Emma said during her remarks at the dedication ceremony, "is that every family has secrets, but not every family has the courage to face them. My mom taught me that facing hard truths makes you stronger, even when it's scary." The ripple effects of their investigation continued to expand in ways that none of them had anticipated. Military contractors whose founding families had profited from wartime corruption faced ongoing congressional oversight and were required to fund transparency initiatives as part of their government contracts. Defense budgets now included mandatory allocations for historical accountability research. More significantly, the cultural impact of their story had fundamentally changed how American society discussed military service and sacrifice. The simplistic narrative of heroic soldiers and virtuous leaders had given way to more nuanced understanding that honored genuine sacrifice while acknowledging institutional failures that had betrayed the very people they claimed to serve. Sarah's speaking engagements had evolved from historical presentations to workshops on moral courage and institutional accountability. She traveled extensively, teaching others how to research family histories, document evidence of institutional misconduct, and protect themselves while pursuing dangerous truths. One of her most powerful presentations took place at the Pentagon itself, where she addressed senior military leadership about the importance of creating cultures that protected rather than punished truth-tellers. The same institution that had once covered up General Morrison's crimes now showcased Sarah's work as an example of how civilian accountability could strengthen rather than undermine military effectiveness. Aunt Evelyn's investigation didn't weaken American military institutions, Sarah told the assembled generals and admirals. It strengthened them by demonstrating that accountability and transparency are essential for maintaining public trust and institutional integrity. The international recognition of their work had brought unexpected opportunities for both Sarah and Emma. They had been invited to witness truth and reconciliation processes in countries recovering from conflicts, where Sarah's expertise in documenting historical injustices proved invaluable for societies seeking to heal from institutional betrayals. Emma's education had become a collaborative international effort, with scholars from around the world contributing to her understanding of history, justice, and individual responsibility. She was fluent in 3 languages, had traveled to more than 20 countries, and possessed a level of historical and political sophistication that amazed everyone who met her. But perhaps the most meaningful development was the ongoing relationship they had built with other military families whose lives had been shattered by the same conspiracy. The Morrison revelations had triggered a cascade of investigations that identified hundreds of soldiers who had been murdered to protect criminal operations, and their families finally had official acknowledgement of their losses. The annual Morrison Memorial Service, held each year on the anniversary of Lieutenant James Morrison's death, had become a gathering point for families seeking justice for suppressed military crimes. Sarah and Emma attended every year, not as celebrities, but as part of a community united by their commitment to honoring the memory of soldiers who had died protecting their integrity rather than their superiors' crimes. Richard Morrison's transformation had been perhaps the most dramatic of all. He had donated his entire inherited fortune to veterans' causes, taken a modest salary working at the Transparency Center, and devoted his life to helping other families confront their own inherited secrets. His work had inspired dozens of other descendants of military criminals to acknowledge their families' histories and make meaningful amends. Living with inherited privilege built on other people's suffering is a form of moral cancer, Richard explained during one of his frequent presentations to military ethics classes. You can pretend it doesn't affect you, but it corrupts everything you touch until you find the courage to cut it out. The farmhouse itself had become a pilgrimage site, not just for researchers and military families, but for anyone struggling with the decision to speak truth to power. Sarah had preserved Aunt Evelyn's attic office exactly as they had found it, but the rest of the house had been converted into residential facilities for researchers, guest quarters for visiting families, and meeting spaces for organizations working on military accountability issues. Emma's bedroom in the farmhouse had become a repository for letters, drawings, and gifts from children around the world whose families had been inspired by their story. The room was filled with artwork depicting courage, justice, and truth-telling, created by young people who understood that individual actions could have global consequences. The establishment of the Transparency Center had also created unexpected economic benefits for Millbrook Valley. The small town had transformed from a forgotten rural community into a destination for international visitors interested in military history and institutional accountability. Local businesses thrived, serving the steady stream of researchers, journalists, and military families who came to study at the center. Sarah's relationship with the local community had evolved from outsider to beloved neighbor to respected leader. She served on the town council, supported local schools, and had helped establish Millbrook Valley as a model community for military family support services. Her presence had attracted other military accountability advocates to the area, creating a concentration of expertise that benefited veterans throughout the region. The legal ramifications of their discoveries continued to unfold years after their initial revelations. Class action lawsuits filed by families of murdered soldiers had resulted in unprecedented settlements from defense contractors and government agencies. The financial compensation, while it could never restore lost lives, provided resources for veteran support services and military accountability research. More importantly, the legal precedents established by their case had made it significantly easier for future truth-tellers to challenge institutional cover-ups. The Cartwright Legal Defense Fund provided free legal representation for whistleblowers and family members investigating military misconduct, removing financial barriers that had previously protected corrupt institutions. Emma's role in their ongoing work had evolved as she matured. She now served as a youth coordinator for the Transparency Center, helping other children whose families were investigating military secrets. Her natural empathy and sophisticated understanding of complex moral issues made her an effective counselor for young people struggling with family revelations. The hardest part isn't discovering that your family has secrets, Emma explained during a youth workshop she led for teenagers from military families. The hardest part is deciding whether you're going to be the person who keeps the secrets or the person who helps heal the damage they caused. Sarah's personal life had also been transformed by their mission. She had married Dr. Marcus Webb, a military psychologist who specialized in helping veterans process moral injury and institutional betrayal. Their relationship had grown from professional collaboration on veteran support services to deep personal partnership based on shared commitment to military accountability. Marcus brought his own expertise in trauma recovery to their work, helping military families process the psychological impact of discovering that their loved ones had been murdered or that their own families had profited from military crimes. His presence had strengthened both the Transparency Center's services and Sarah's personal resilience. The couple's work had become a model for how civilian and military communities could collaborate to address historical injustices while building stronger institutions for the future. Their marriage itself had become a symbol of hope for military families, demonstrating that truth-telling and accountability could strengthen rather than destroy military communities. Emma had gained not just a stepfather, but a mentor who helped her understand the psychological complexities of their work. Marcus taught her about moral injury, institutional betrayal, and the healing power of truth-telling, preparing her for the leadership role she seemed destined to assume in the military accountability movement. The 10th anniversary of their discovery was marked by the opening of the Cartwright Digital Archive, a comprehensive online repository of military accountability research that had become the premier resource for scholars worldwide. The archive included not just Aunt Evelyn's original documents, but thousands of additional pieces of evidence contributed by families and researchers from around the globe. Sarah's keynote address at the anniversary celebration reflected on the remarkable journey that had begun with a reluctant inheritance and evolved into a global movement for military transparency. She spoke to an audience that included military leaders, government officials, academic researchers, and ordinary families who had found the courage to investigate their own difficult histories. Aunt Evelyn taught us that truth has its own power, Sarah concluded her address, standing at the podium where her great-aunt's portrait looked down on the assembled crowd. She showed us that one person with unwavering commitment to justice can preserve evidence that will eventually transform the world, But most importantly, she demonstrated that the courage to pursue truth, even when it seems hopeless, is never wasted. As the celebration continued into the evening, Sarah and Emma walked through the farmhouse one final time, reflecting on how dramatically their lives had changed since that first discovery in the attic. The house that had once seemed like a burden had become the foundation for a mission that had touched lives around the world. Emma, now taller than her mother and possessing the confident bearing of someone who had grown up changing the world, paused at the foot of the attic stairs. "Do you think Aunt Evelyn knew what would happen when she preserved all that evidence?" Sarah considered the question, thinking about the remarkable woman who had spent decades alone in pursuit of truth, never knowing if anyone would ever discover her work. "I think she knew that truth always finds a way to the surface, even if it takes longer than we expect. She trusted that someone would eventually have the courage to finish what she started." They climbed the attic stairs one more time, standing in the preserved office where Aunt Evelyn had spent countless nights documenting evidence of injustice. The space felt peaceful now, filled with the satisfaction of a mission completed and a legacy secured. As they prepared to leave the attic, Emma asked one final question that captured the essence of their remarkable journey. "Mum, what do you think we'll discover next?" Sarah smiled, knowing that their work was far from over. Around the world, other families were finding their own hidden evidence of institutional injustice. Other individuals were discovering their capacity for moral courage. Other truth-tellers were preserving evidence for future generations to discover and act upon. The inheritance that had begun with a diary in a dusty attic had become a global movement that would continue long after Sarah and Emma were gone. Aunt Evelyn's legacy lived on, not just in the institutions they had created, but in the countless individuals who had been inspired to choose truth over comfort, justice over convenience, and courage over silence. As they turned off the lights and left the attic for the final time that evening, Sarah felt Aunt Evelyn's presence one last time, not as a ghost from the past, but as an eternal inspiration for the future. The lonely vigil had ended, but the mission it had created would continue forever, carried forward by new generations of truth-tellers who understood that some secrets are too important to keep buried. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.